Welcome to Agape Ministries podcasts, a whole new way of thinking. Episode 12, Part 1 of Sister Helen Prejean's talk, Made for Love. Sister Helen is introduced by David Wells.
Notice on the screen, just as I'm speaking to you now, that we're just going to set up for a short film clip, so don't be too distracted by that. One of the things that I know is going to stop you from being embarrassed today is if that little phone in your pocket is absolutely turned off, because you don't want to be the person that everybody's looking at in 11 minutes' time. So please do make sure that that phone is on silent. It really would help. Thank you. I'll be guiding you. My name is David Wells, and I'll be guiding you through the day, just joining the little bits and pieces together. And it's my job now to introduce Sister Helen. And I'm going to tell you first and foremost, the reason that she's addressing us today is not actually because she wrote a book. She wrote a book called Dead Men Walking, which became a bestseller, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, which has been translated into 10 languages, and which has sold literally millions of copies throughout the world. And that's not why she's here today. And neither is it the reason that she's here today that Tim Robbins, inspired by Susan Sarandon, made that book into a movie of the same name. And neither is she here because, in a sense, that film, although in Hollywood terms was a dangerous movie to make, it was trying to address the issue of forgiveness in a culture which was predominantly encouraging the death penalty, and yet it won for Susan Sarandon the Best Actress award at the Oscars. And for none of those reasons she's here, really. And I want to tell you why she is here. About 10 years ago, I found myself purely by accident, entirely fortunately, sitting at a table next to Helen. I had no idea who she was. And sitting around the table were a number of publishing agencies. And I said to Helen, "So Helen, tell me a little bit about yourself." And you know, everybody else went quiet, and I knew in that moment, it's an emotion I have regularly, which is "you stupid man." And I sat there, and I could tell from the reaction of everybody else around the table that I'd just said a stupid thing. And you know what she did? Because none of the glitz of celebrity has fallen upon her. She just said to me, "Well, David, you tell me a little bit about yourself, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself." And since then, I've had the blessing of a growing friendship over the years. And yesterday, I have to tell you that Helen spoke in a school with 450 young people yesterday afternoon. It wasn't a Catholic school, and she was in there, and the head of RE rang me up this morning and said, "David, I've just had a 14-year-old boy sitting in my office saying to me, if that's what Christianity is, I want to be one." Now, I'm just saying that to you because the reason that Helen is here is that she's authentic. And so I want to welcome Sister Helen Prejean.
It's good to be here. I thought of you this morning when I got up. Some of you got hauled here on buses. There was an announcement made. We were going to have this gathering. Some of you came far. Some of you had to leave early in the morning to get here. And you know that first awakening consciousness, oh Lord, they're going to drag us in buses and whatever. We're going to hear some nun talk, and we're going to be in this amphitheater, and all the different mixed emotions of our hearts, because it just comes with our humanness. Well, I want you to know I'm happy to be here with you today, and I get to do something very precious. That, you know, we're the only ones who can reveal our hearts to each other. To reveal the interiority of our lives is a very spiritual thing. And I'm going to get to lay that before you, my life, and to share it with you. And I don't have a set speech. What I have that you can't see are these two huge bags by me of stories and experiences. And so all we're going to talk about today is I'm going to tell you, let me tell you what happened to me. Now we're going to show a clip of the film A Dead Man Walking. It's a blooming miracle that the film got to be. It's a blooming miracle that he got 4 nominations for the Academy Awards. It's a blooming miracle that the Oscars happened on the Feast of the Annunciation. I mean, it was an annunciation like I had never seen before, because there were 1.3 billion people watching the Oscars, and Dead Man Walking was given over to the world. Now, when your little boat hits a current and the wave goes like that, you know that's of God. And so we're all part of that wave and that current. I'm going to show you the clip because it's going to crystallize what the journey of the film in my own life is about, and then I'm going to talk to you. So let's look at it now.
This man shot Walter Delacroix, raped Hope Percy, and stabbed her 17 times. In the courtroom at a sentencing, he was smiling and chewing his gum. He is an unfeeling, perverse misfit, and it is time.
You've put in a request to be the spiritual advisor to Matthew Poncelet. This boy is to be executed in 6 days. You know what you're getting into. They are all con men. You must be very, very careful.
Well, Matthew, I made it.
You never done this before?
No.
Never been this close to a murderer before?
Not that I know of.
What is a nun doing in a place like this?
I ain't killed nobody. I swear to God I didn't.
Poncelet claims Vitello killed both of them.
Both say the other did the actual killing, and somebody's lying to somebody.
Let's talk about that night.
I don't want to talk about that.
As your friend, I want to help you die with dignity, and I don't see how you can do that unless you start to own up to the part you played in Walter and Hope's death.
That scum robbed me of my only son.
You don't know when you see your child leave through a door that you're never going to see them alive again.
Do you ever think about those kids?
I'm going to take a lie detector test. I want my mama to know I didn't kill any kids.
How can you sit by Poncelet's side?
I like being alone with you. You're looking real good to me.
Death is breathing down your neck. You're playing your little man on the main games.
You still got a judge in the federal court that can put a stop to this.
What possessed you to be in the woods that night?
I told you I was thrown out of my head.
You blame the government, you blame drugs, you blame blacks.
Get out of the car!
What about Matthew Poncelet?
This is not a person. This is an animal.
So I got a thing or two to say the person's in the Delacroix.
You want your last words to be words of hatred?
Dead man walking.
From writer-director Tim Robbins comes a story about looking into the eyes of a killer and finding the heart of a man. Susan Sarandon.
I want the last thing you see in this world to be a face of love. So you look at me.
Sean Penn.
Number 5, number 7, number okay.
Governor, please, don't execute this man.
Dead Man Walking.
Of course, when the dead man walks, that's resurrection. I want to tell you a story. And it's my life. It's the unfolding of God in my heart. It's how it caught on fire. We don't know how we catch on fire. You know, when we get insight, when suddenly things become clear, and then we get the call, this is what you got to do. That's always grace. It's grace, grace, grace every way that we look at it. The awakening. And I never would have gone to death row. I didn't become a nun to go to death row. You know, that he says, what's a nun doing in a place like this? That was Captain Rabelais in the death house. We got into it one day about the Bible and all. He said, sister, now you know what these people did? The murder, you know what they did? And you know what the Bible says? An eye for an eye, those that shed blood. And I said, do you also know what the Bible said, what Jesus said? You've heard it said an eye for an eye, but I say to you, did you know there were 37 different crimes in the Old Testament for which you could get the death penalty? Adultery, you want to do that? We wipe out the population, start giving a death penalty for it. And I was naming, I was clicking them off, and he said, I ain't going to get no Bible quote with no none because I'm going to lose. The unfolding of the journey. The first part of it is growing up in a close family of love and prayer, faith. So Mom and Dad were supportive when I said, I want to be a nun. I had great nuns teach me. I wanted to be a teacher. I was with teachers all day yesterday, and I've been with teachers in Liverpool, and I've been with teachers in Newcastle. Teaching has got to be one of the best things you could ever do with your life, because it's all about being with young people and being with adults, being with our fellow human beings, and about waking up and sharing and then also learning constantly from each other. And so our teachers were great. Our nuns were great. They were human. They were funny. They were full of faith. And I said, I want to be that. I never could quite picture myself, like marrying one little man, having one little family with the little picket fence. Like, I wanted to go wide with my love. And I became a nun. And of course, everything unfurled under us when Vatican II happened, and nobody took it more seriously than the nuns in the United States, because it was about being alive and being with the people. And actually, nuns are part of the people of God. We're part of lay people. We're not clergy. We're just in there with you like everybody else, And so we began growing. Always, though, for me, the drinking from the well of the Scriptures, always learning about the Scriptures and about Jesus, because that's the font, that's the well. And but then applying it, see. And for a long time, as the debate happened in the community about that, we were called not just to be with people who were well off. Yes, they need us too. But what about the poor and the suffering ones? And see, I was blind to that. Culture blinds us. Culture is the thing inside our head that says, this is the way things are, this is what we got to do, this is what we've always done. And those people are the ones you got to be afraid of. So I grew up as a child of privilege in the deep South in Louisiana. My daddy was a successful lawyer. And the only way I knew African American people when I was growing up was as our servants. And it was days of segregation. Black people couldn't drink from a water fountain. Sacred Heart Church, they sat way over to the right of the church in their own little niche and had to come to Holy Communion last. And I never questioned that. I just thought that's just the way things are. And the awakening. I lived in New Orleans. I lived in New Orleans in the suburbs. And parish churches were geographically located. So I was going to church with people just like me. And in the inner city in New Orleans, over 50% of people in the inner city lived in poverty and were African American. And I had never been inside that inner city. I was always like, well, I'm meant to take care of the people in St. Francis Cabrini Parish. And then the debate started. See, the thing about belonging to a community of faith is somebody gets in there and is always stirring the pot. You got this fermentation going on. You got this mixing it up, stirring the pot. So somebody has started stirring the pot in the community. How come none of us are directly in there with poor people and suffering people? How come all of us are in the suburbs? And man, I resisted that. I went, that is not the gospel. Jesus said, people don't live by bread alone. And I would make wonderful speeches. That's why you're always going to be humble when you're with your own community, because they remember you win. And I'd get up and I'd say things like, well, if the poor have God, they have everything. And I don't know any really poor people. I don't know what's happening to African American people in the inner city of New Orleans. When I wrote this book, Dead Man Walking, I found out there were more complaints about police brutality against African American people in the city of New Orleans than any other city in the nation. But I was living in my little terrarium. I was living in my little bubble. I was living in my little globe. And it could have been in India. So here it is in the community. We need to be called to the poor. Well, who are the poor? You know, like the little girl at the time that wrote this essay on the poor family. She said once there was a very, very poor family. The mother was poor, the father was poor, the children were poor. The butler was poor, the gardener was poor, the chauffeur was poor, the whole family was poor. And I could have written a blooming essay because I didn't know any real people. And then, of course, the prejudices and stereotypes and the fears that happen in us about those people are all in me as well. And then I hear we have to get on a bus, and we are going to a place called Terre Haute, Indiana, because this nun is going to come talk to us for 3 days. 3 days, and I heard that she's one of those social justice nuns. I went, Lord. 3 days, maybe I can come through. With your grace, I can come through unscathed. Because I was in the camp of the spiritual nuns. All we have to do is tell people about God. We have to do retreats, all of which is important, of course. It's the groundwork. Because if we don't know we're loved of God, and if we don't know that all we have to do is be quiet, as Jesus told us, and open up the door to the inner room of our heart, God's there. We can talk to God anytime. It's one of the reasons the religious leaders may have wanted to kill Jesus, because they're all into the temple sacrifice, and then you give your little offering for the temple sacrifice, and that's their little salaries for the temple cult. And Jesus and John the Baptist too, calling people to personal renewal. That can God be as close to me as inside my heart? And so prayer, always important to me. And then for 3 days. So here's this nun, and we trapped, kind of like you. And the first day I came through unscathed, because Sister Maria Augusta Neal talked about injustices in the world, rich countries of the world. United States consumes 1/4 of all the resources of the world. We're responsible for 1/4 of all the carbon footprint and the pollution in the air our country consume, waste. I knew that. I basically knew the facts. I knew the kids in India starving. I know it's, or Haiti. I know we got to go on diets because we eat too much. We overweight, they starving. But I said to myself, that's the way the world's always been. I'm one little person. What am I supposed to do with that? If the poor have God, they have everything. People just need to go and talk to them about God. And so I slept real well that night, and she had announced she was going to talk about Jesus. I went, bring it on, man. I know a little bit about Jesus. I've been meditating on Jesus my whole life. I did the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. I was quiet 30 whole days, just me and God and me and Jesus getting it together. Bring on Jesus. Yeah, sure. What are you going to tell me about Jesus I never heard before? And this is how the fire happens. And so Sister Maria Augusta Neal talked about Jesus. And I sat, just like you're sitting in here. And I can tell you the line that she said that changed the trajectory of my life and brought me to poor people, then to death row, and brings me to you. And she said, Jesus preached good news to poor people. And she said, integral to the good news to people who are being ground up by poverty is that they don't have to accept poverty as the will of God, that they are meant to have everything they need in their life, and they are to resist the injustice, and they are not to be poor anymore. And I'm thinking, Jesus said, the poor you'll always have with you. Aren't there some things that is just the way life is? That integral to the good news of Jesus was the kind of community that he gathered and started where everyone had dignity and no one was in need. Do not accept the poverty. Do not accept when I'm in New York and I see the homeless people. Do not accept that is God's will. That it's to be resisted and it's to be changed. I'm reading a book now, Dorothy Soul's book called Mysticism and Resistance. Because there's a way we can say, well, Poor people, if they suffer with Jesus on the cross, they're poor, their children die before they're 5, they don't have health care, they don't have enough to eat, they live in a shack. Well, if they accept that suffering from God, that's God's will for them, and one day they're going to have a great reward in heaven. But it's not my mama who has to work and clean buildings. It's not my daddy who's there having to get whatever temporary job he can to put food on the table. It's not my family that is suffering that. And so it's like, I get it. For the first time I sat there and I went, to follow Jesus means I need to be involved in the works of justice. I don't even know the poor people in my own city. Here's the thing. Doesn't matter when we wake up to anything about the gospel and what we call it. Doesn't matter when. There's no time with God. It's what we do after we wake up. I did something real simple. I did something real profound. What I did was I moved out of the suburbs and began to live with poor people in the inner city who had always been there. And it was like I saw another America. All the rules were different. All the experiences of people were different. Nothing worked the way I had seen it. I, who was born in privilege, knew how to draw on resources, watched my daddy do that. Now I see people in public housing like Miss Eva, and the bathroom floor is permanently wet because she's had a leak in there for 2 years, and she can't get the maintenance people to come in public housing and fix a leak. And I see people being poor means you wait. Being poor means you wait in charity hospital with a sick child, trembling and shivering with fever, and you wait on average 6 hours for an intern who's learned to be a doctor to come take care of your child because you're poor. Or Mr. Robinson down the street who died, who had a heart attack, but he didn't have insurance and no ambulance came to pick him up. Or the kids coming from the schools, coming into our adult learning center. And they're coming like, they're in there like their 11th year. Well, how far did you get in school? Well, I was a junior, 11th year. Well, look, let's see where your reading level is. Let's see where your math level is. We're going to work with you individually to get your high school diploma. And the kid can't read a 3rd grade book. He can't read a reader that 3rd graders in primary school. What's going to happen to this young African-American kid in the United States of America who's going to try to go into the workforce and he can't read? Why did I learn to read? Why did I go to St. Joseph Academy and be taught by nuns who was so good? Why, when I was a junior in high school, I learned public speaking. I learned that faith in Christ was going to be the center of my life, and out of that spiritual center, I would be part of community. And that with Christ in me, I could do anything in the world. I learned my gifts. I learned how to write. So one day when I sat down to write a book, I knew how to write. Why was it all given to me? And look at these kids. And I began to realize that a river is not this big, flat, broad body of water that just glides into the sea. That the river is filled with whirlpools and eddies and currents and waterfalls. And these kids were caught in these currents of poverty, racism. They found a notebook from a policeman in New Orleans and reporting on a crime, and it's called NON. Nigger on nigger. Negligible. I began to notice that when white people were killed in the city of New Orleans, you're going to find their picture on the front pages of the newspaper. And when black kids were killed, you couldn't find it on page 35 with 3 lines. If your life's negligible, your death's negligible. And as I begin to learn about the death penalty and how it's applied, I begin to find out then, too, almost always, to be in the lottery for the death penalty, the first requirement is, who'd you kill? Who's your victim? Is it a homeless person on the streets of the city? Who cares about a homeless person? And it correlates with race. Did you kill a white person or not? And then you begin to learn a long history. Louisiana was one of the slave states. And when slaves were freed, they were over 50% of the population. White people were scared. We have the harshest penal code A black man could steal an apple and be hung. And then I'm going to learn, as I learn about how the death penalty comes down, I'm going to learn that the states that were the slave states and lynched people the most are the ones who do the executions in the United States. They just killed Troy Davis in Georgia 2 days ago. He went to trial. Georgia. 9 kids, black kids, pointed to Troy in that courtroom and said, Troy killed a policeman. Black kid, white policeman. 9 kids. It was slam dunk for the jury. Every one of the kids gets up. Every one of the kids takes the oath. Every one of the kids said Troy did it. Troy goes to death row in Georgia. The years go by, and these good lawyers, these are the lawyers I meet. I meet lawyers who defend the poor. I meet lawyers who get in there and try to save people's lives. Whenever I talk to young people, whenever I talk in law schools, I say to them, whatever professional life you have as a lawyer, always have a room in your professional building for the poor. Because when you're poor and you're up against the powers of the state for long-term imprisonment or even for your life, you need a lawyer by your side. And poor people get whatever they're appointed to, and that's what happened with Troy. But then as the appeals go on and you get good pro bono lawyers getting in there, do it with no money, you have to raise the funds, they begin to talk to each of those kids, and they find out all of those kids were pressured by the police in the questioning that they had better say that at trial or they were going to throw them in prison for the rest of their lives. And they lied because they were scared and they were intimidated. And so as the lawyers began to work with the case, 7 out of the 9 kids, and it's a brave thing for them to do, because they can always go back and get them for perjury. You said that, we can throw 7 out of the 9. Then said, we were scared, we said that, but it wasn't the truth. Troy is not the one who shot the policeman. And it goes to the courts. In the second book I wrote called Death of Innocence, about accompanying 2 innocent people who were executed in the United States, Dobie Williams and Joseph Odell, I talked about the courts. I thought if something was the law of the land, I thought if you had a great constitution like we have in the United States that calls for people to have due process and a jury of their peers, it looks like fairness. It looks like justice can happen. And the courts are the ones that are upholding and making things legal. So you know what basically happened with Troy and why they killed him the other day? Because by the time it got in the courts for an appeals, what they basically said was, you should have shown that at trial. It's too late to bring it into the courts. The time has elapsed. Procedures, legal procedures. Thomas Merton, Trappist monk, said that when the world ends, it's going to be legal. You legalize something. I mean, we saw that in the United States with Abu Ghraib. And the torture memos came out between Rumsfeld and the people the lawyers for the Justice Department make torture legal. We got to get around those Geneva Conventions. So you know the first thing you do is you say they're not prisoners of war. They don't have any rights. They're suspected terrorists. They're enemy combatants. Change the wording. And then you can do it legally. You can waterboard people, and I know some of the lawyers who have worked in these cases in Guantanamo and what we were doing to people, but first you got to make it legal. And what happened to Troy is he died because the courts got caught in their own legal procedures and closed off the switch. And there were people from all over the world appealing for Troy. And the southern states, the governor, the prosecutor who got that kid on death row, they're not going to back up. They're not going to say, oh, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. They even brought it before President Obama, and there were people before the White House. And you know what I love about English people? Because I've been over here many times. You were in there. Through Amnesty International, There were British people all over appealing for Troy's life. Because we don't just live in the circumference and geography of our little world. We're in a global village. And you, the British people, were appealing for him. What happened is when I woke up to the poor and I moved into the St. Thomas housing projects, everything came with that. The first thing I saw was the greased rail between families in St. Thomas and prisons. And the way my classmates and I would talk about who was going to what university, every family in St. Thomas is talking about who's in what prison. I didn't know how it worked. I knew people went to prison because they broke the law, and we needed to have prisons because we needed to protect ourselves against violent people that did crimes. I didn't know who goes to prison. And during the 80s, when the law and order started coming in it was Ronald Reagan in the States, and you had Thatcher, and it was like, we have to punish criminals. Law and order. You know, we can't allow the violence and the chaos in society, and bigger criminal sentences were given to people. California, in 28 years, built 27 prisons and 1 university. And we can see our societies coming apart at the seams economically because we have such a big gap now between rich and poor. And poverty means that you're going to have chaos. Poverty means you can't get a job. Poverty means you're in a dead-end life. Poverty means families break apart. Part of the reason that black families break apart is young women can't find young men to marry because so many are in prison. 1 in every 3 young black men ages 20 to 29 are in the prison system in the United States because they made drugs a felony. Poverty kills you. It's not just something you endure. And it must be resisted and it must be changed. In the United States, we have 400 people who have incomes that are equivalent to 150,000, half of the population. They make the income of half of the population of the United States. That's how big it's getting. And then with the struggle in politics, it's cut the social programs, always to cut the social programs. And a meanness of spirit that's happening in our country. We worked hard for our money, and now we're going to have those people, they want to be on welfare, they want public housing. Get government out of all of that. It should be private. So the so-called free market. Martin Luther King used to say the most moral document you ever look at is a budget. And you know that. From the struggles at school to get from the budget that you need for the kids or this or that, how's the budget done? Where does the money go? Where do the resources go? And it's one of the things that's going to end the death penalty in the United States because they don't have the money to carry out this expensive machinery of death with years of appeals. Years and years and years that people are kept on death row. The 4 states that have done away with the death penalty in the United States, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Illinois, partly it's because they have this expensive machinery of death that's eating up their budget. Well, why not take it away from death, put it into life, and let's put it in food programs for children or care programs for at-risk youth. Put it into life. The culture of life and the culture of death works itself out in economics like it works itself out in everything. Who cares, though? Who cares? And I wake up. My prayer, when I got to St. Thomas and began to live among people whom I had only known as my servants, who are now my peers, who are now teaching me, and the young civil rights leaders, black men in the community, are teaching me how racism works. They say it starts in language. How come you always say white and pure, and you say blackball? And the way that even the language, linguistic racism of how we use the word black. I learn. I'm ready to learn. And I'll start reading the lives of the saints now that I'm ready for. because I'm ready now to put in my life to live for justice and stand alongside people who are poor and struggling and never got what I got. And it's not that I was so virtuous, it's just that I was untested. There's a little girl coming into the Adult Learning Center. She's 14 years old. She's had her first baby. And she's rocking that little baby like a doll and saying, now I finally have something of my very own. Or I see the kids getting hooked on drugs, doing drugs as a business. If they get a mainstream job at McDonald's or Burger King, they're going to still get a minimum wage and still live in poverty. And you see that it's a sub-economy for people who can't make it in the mainstream economy. It's not just some people are virtuous and some people are not. What current are you in the river? And I read the lives of the saints. I read Martin Luther King. His story's amazing. He led a nonviolent Christian movement in the United States that ended segregation, ended our formal means of apartheid, of the Jim Crow laws that kept black people down. He had been offered a position to be a professor up in the Northeast. He was about ready to marry Coretta. He'd have had a much better life than going back to the Deep South. He wouldn't have had fire bombs thrown into his living room. He wouldn't have been assassinated and his life ended short because of what he did to lead the civil rights movement. We don't go when we start to lead a movement. We don't know we lead a movement. We're just doing what we know we got to do, what's right, and then it happens. God's Spirit works. And so I wake up, and the prayer was always, I was so grateful to be awake, because for so long I hadn't been awake, and I hadn't gotten it. I just said, thank you, God. Thank you for waking me up. And I'm listening, and I'm taking notes, and I'm reading, and I'm listening to the people who are telling me what it's like. Every time everybody has a gun. Every time the mamas hear a gunfire in the neighborhood, they at the door, where's my child, where's my child? And then one day coming out of the Adult Learning Center, it was so casual. The best things of God just happened to us, we plunked down by each other. And a friend who was working in the prison coalition office right around the corner from Hope House said, hey, Sister Helen, you want to write a letter? Somebody on death row? I said, yeah, I could write some letters. I just want to say that we need to put into RE, we need to put into theology the sneakiness of God. Because when Chavez said to me, Sister Helen, you want to write to a man on death row? I never dreamed they were going to kill this person in an electric chair. We hadn't had an execution in Louisiana in over 20 years. There had been an unofficial moratorium on the death penalty that had begun in the 60s and went through the 70s. I hadn't even noticed in 1976 that the Supreme Court had put the death penalty back. What did I have to do with the death penalty? I don't know anybody on death row. And so I said, yeah, I'll write a letter. And he gave me the name of the man. And I sat down and I wrote the man. Patrick Sonnier was his name. In the movie, Tim Robbins explained, in Dead Man Walking, you have two stories, two death row inmates, two victims' families, and he said that's too many characters in a film. The reason a film is always going to be different from a book is because you got to pare it down. You got 2 hours to take people on this journey. But he was real clear about what the journey was going to be. Because we had a lot of films in the United States, and it always ended with, if the person was guilty of the crime, it ended with the execution, justice was done, and the reflection stopped. He said, we're going to do a film the way you wrote your book. And it's the journey I'm going to take you on now with me. Because first getting into it, writing a man, not dreaming they were going to kill him. God's grace comes up underneath us when we need it, not ahead of time. And the Spirit works with us gently when we're ready, and it's like the petals of a rose that open. So first it was, would you write a letter? Yeah, I could write a letter. And then you know what the problem was? He wrote back, and there was an encounter.
I can remember the morning of the talk that Helen gave. There was a real buzz about the theatre that day, because there must have been about 700 or 800 teachers who had been bussed in from all over the place, and they looked like weary travellers. It was only quite early in the morning, but obviously they had had a much earlier start because they were coming from all over. And some of them looked tired before the day had even begun. So that was the audience that Helen walked out to. There was almost like a weariness about them. But what I actually noticed in a very, very short time, when Helen started to talk and sharing only her own story, sharing the path that she was on and had been led on to by God, that you could almost hear a pin drop in the hall. People had gone from lying back in their chairs to actually leaning forward in a listening position. That's what she changed that hall within 5 minutes, just by her goodness and kindness.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. Tune in again next week to hear some more wise words about how you can strengthen that dream for a safer, healthier and happier world that's in every human heart. And if you think of someone else that you know that might be helped by this wisdom, then please feel free to share this link with them, because freely we have received, freely